Hello, David here at merchantaccounts.ca. Today I'm going to demystify the difference between a merchant account, a payment gateway, and a payment processor. Three things that all sound like the same thing, they're not. And if you understand the difference between them, it will make it easier to set up credit card processing for your business. Stay tuned, we'll dig in 1 second. So we'll start by talking about the merchant account. This is the part of the system or the transaction flow that facilitates the movement of money, because whenever you take a credit card payment, money does actually move. If you need a comparison, a merchant account is kind of like a bank account. The money gets deposited, it gets taken from your customer's card, put into your merchant account, and from there it's shot out to your business bank account daily or weekly. This is very important from a pricing perspective. In fact, it's the most important. Merchants pay what's called a discount rate every time they process a transaction. This is the percentage-based fee that you pay whenever you run a card. And if you're confused about that, we have lots of material on merchantaccounts.ca to teach you about pricing. But anyways, it's the main cost. So whenever you are looking at your credit card processing infrastructure and your costs, the merchant account is the most important part of it. This is where you're going to go to look at your statements. The merchant account is where you go to reconcile and balance things, and it's really important that you understand that part of it. Well, I think we squared that away. So let's look at part number 2 now, which is the payment gateway. The payment gateway is the technical service that your website interacts with when it wants to process a transaction. And that is a terrible explanation, isn't it? It's the technical thing. When your website says, hey, I need a transaction to be processed, I gotta talk to someone to make this happen, your website will talk to a payment gateway to say, hey, other website, hey, payment gateway, wake up. I want to process $100 for this customer. Here's a credit card number, and here's an amount, and here's the person's details. Can you check and see if they're good for it? So back to my little more technical explanation, the API receives the transaction request from your website, and behind the scenes it goes to Visa or Mastercard and ultimately onto the card issuing bank and finds out if the customer has enough money for the transaction. And if it's approved, the transaction now happens, the process happens in reverse. In the same way that your website spoke to the payment gateway sends a response back to you. And it all happens, in milliseconds. It's like, hey, do you remember you just asked me about this customer, John, like a second ago? Turns out he had the money. Here's your approval code. So the payment gateway is the technical thing that your website talks to when you want a payment to be processed. And it's very important that you understand this, because if you're building a website or you have a website and you want to set up e-commerce transactions, your website has to know how to talk to the payment gateway. When people talk about integrations or compatibility, it means, does the software that you run on your website know how to talk to the payment gateway so that they can speak clearly and the transactions will work? That's the payment gateway. In terms of the cost, every time you pay a flat cents per transaction fee, for example, like 20 cents per transaction, that is the gateway fee. And if we're being really, really technically accurate, it's like a database query. Every time your system says, hey, gateway, run a query for me. Here's this guy, John, here's his card, but technically this is a query. You're paying a set per transaction fee. Gateway costs are more important if you do lower average tickets. If you do bigger transaction volumes, like all costs are important, but weighted, the gateway costs are usually much less important than the merchant account costs overall. This takes us to the last term, payment processor. Now this term does cause some confusion because non-industry folks, like business owners, they talk about their payment processor, their credit card processor, their merchant provider. These terms are all interchangeable. Payment processor actually does mean something else behind the scenes. And I don't want to get overly technical, so I'll keep it brief, but I mentioned before that when your website has a transaction to process, it sends the request to the payment gateway. And I said that the payment gateway talks to Visa. Well, there's a link between the payment gateway and Visa. Ultimately, when a transaction is received, if it's a Visa transaction, it's got to go to Visa. If it's a Mastercard transaction, it has to go to Mastercard. The processor is the switch that routes the transactions to the card brands. And these processing platforms have different capabilities. Some processors might have multi-currency functionality. Others might have the ability to do things like, for example, support a dynamic descriptor. That's where every time you run a transaction, you can print something different, print something custom on the customer's credit card statement. Generally speaking, If you're approaching or discussing payment processing, it's better that you use the phrase your merchant account provider or your merchant services provider, same thing, and your gateway provider. A payment processor is just like for the layperson, it's an interchangeable term used to describe the overall structure. For an industry person, it's actually talking about the processing switch in the background. I hope that made sense. I hope this has demystified a little bit of the difference between a merchant account, a payment gateway, and a payment processor. If you're setting up e-commerce payments for your business, or if you're overwhelmed, reach out to us at merchantaccounts.ca. You can also find a lot of informational articles and videos on our website. Thanks for watching.